was delighted to recently find out that every year, the week before the Super Bowl, it seems that sports fans reject the usual analysis of the regular commentators and instead turn to the animal kingdom for their prognostications. This year's game will feature a battle between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Los Angeles Rams. And local news junkets across the country have been checking in with a wide range of animals in an attempt to decisively determine once and for all who will win. Fox 61 in Connecticut reported that Razzle, the sea lion at the local zoo, swam towards a Bengals football instead of a Rams football, ensuring a Cincinnati victory. Of course, Razzle has made a correct prediction the last 4 of 5 Super Bowls. Sid, the Wolverine at the Montana Zoo, ate a Rams cake instead of a Bengals cake. I guess the Rams will win. And it's no surprise that the Penguins at the Cincinnati Zoo picked their home team. I guess they're a little bit biased. And the Fort Worth, Texas Zoo enlisted a warthog for its divination. But she seemed to just destroy both footballs and then go back in the shade for a nap. We are creatures who love prediction. Sure, the Super Bowl is one example, but we look for forecasts in all other places as well. No longer satisfied with an overnight weather forecast, AccuWeather has begun providing a 21-day forecast. We listen to palm readers, we eat fortune cookies. We anxiously await a groundhog's morning routine and a morning in February to figure out our spring plans. We human beings, we want certainty. And when we can't find it, we'll latch onto almost anything that will point us in some direction. Yes, even a warthog. I've become painfully aware of this urge for certainty, part of many conversations about our synagogue COVID guidelines. We want certainty about the direction things are going. So we look to the CDC and the FDA and Hopkins. We look to opinionated relatives. And while the experts at these institutions have provided important guidance for us in different moments throughout the pandemic, the best guidance they've given has been caution and uncertainty, because we can't truly forecast something that has never happened before. The future is just not so clear. And in religion, the push towards certainty is even more desired. We do 25 hours of repenting on Yom Kippur, but will we be forgiven? Did it actually work? Maybe this year, Rabbi Berg and I will offer pre-game Yom Kippur coverage with our predictions of who in the congregation will finally be inscribed in the book of life. God will tell Moshe in upcoming chapters of the Torah, "You cannot see my face and live." And God already told the Israelites, "You cannot touch Mount Sinai." And all of these are different ways of saying what we all know to be true. You don't get the insider information. You have to wait to see how it plays out like everybody else. But when so much is at stake, that can be incredibly, incredibly nerve-wracking. This week's Parsha mentions our biblical version of the groundhog, or the warthog. It's the priestly vestments called the Ori Batumi. This week's Parsha spends most of its verses describing the clothing that Aaron and high priests will wear when they administer to the functions of the Mishkan, of the holy tent of meeting. The Parsha describes that the priests will wear something called a choshen mishpat, a breastplate of decision. On the breastplate are 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And inside the choshen mishpat is called something that's called the Ori Batumi. And the verse teaches, "Vayu el lev Aharon bevo lifnei Adonai." Aaron will carry these Urim Batumim upon his heart when he enters the sanctuary. And it's a puzzling verse because while the construction and design of each part of the Mishkan and each garment of the priest is meticulously described, the Urim Batumim are not. We're simply told that they should be with Aaron and be on his heart. So what exactly are these items? The lack of a clear explanation suggests that the Urim Batumim were a device that was already well known to the Torah generation. But beyond that, there's pretty much a lot of disagreement. The rabbis of the Talmud suggest that the Urim Batumim were actually parchment with God's name on it. And the parchment would help enlighten matters for the priest who needed to answer difficult questions. Rabbi Yosef Bachor gives a more rational but more limited answer. He suggests that the Ori Batumi were simply little slips of paper behind the stones on the breastplate. And the slips of paper outline the territorial divisions of each tribe in the camp. So if an argument occurred about tribal boundaries, the high priest could simply take out these papers and, kind of like a biblical zoning code, could ensure that everyone knew their correct subdivisions. Perhaps most convincingly, though, at least to me, is a more interesting interpretation of contemporary scholars who compared these verses to other verses in the Bible and suggest that the Urim Batumim are lots. That the words, if we listen, Urim Batuvim, we actually hear other Hebrew words, Ra and Tov, bad and good. And in this understanding, the Urim and the Tumim were simply two stones, one labeled bad and one labeled good. And they could be drawn when a difficult decision needed to be made. It's fascinating, it's a bit puzzling. Why would the priest leave some of the most important decisions of the community to a coin flip? Well, perhaps because that's how lots of decisions were made in the biblical era. On Yom Kippur, we recall the story of lots that are drawn to determine which goat will be sent into the wilderness of Azazel and which goat will be slaughtered. Lots are clearly used before this instance, and they'll be used again in the Tanakh. We're about to read the story of Esther, literally the story of lots, Purim. But of course, the Urim Batumim are meant to be of a different character, a holy character. They're not just regular lots. These are the lots that God has sanctioned. They sit next to the heart of the priest, and they represent that God is with him and his descendants. And the Torah makes clear that not all divine interpretation, not all games of chance are equal. Later, the Torah will warn against future telling, saying, "You shall not practice divination or soothsaying." And according to the biblical scholar Jonathan Stokel, part of what might be happening here is that the priestly source who writes part of the Torah is recasting these regular objects as priestly ritual objects. Basically saying, of course, you all use lots and other games of chance, but only trust those that are used in the context of this very specific priestly system. I'm stuck focusing on the Urim Batumim this week because it's one of the moments of Torah where I hear a deep desire of the biblical authors to confront their spiritual questions. These priests, thousands of years ago, who wanted to maintain a connection with the divine, and yet they did not always know if they were precisely hearing God's voice. They had to make important decisions for their spiritual community and for their political community. They wanted God to approve of their decisions, and yet they could not speak directly to God. How would they know if what they were doing was correct? Well, they had their divination device. They had their Ori Batumi. And that would have to do. And the cynic in me scoffs because they're just two lots. It's putting the most important decisions to a coin flip. But the spiritual person in me marvels. Because how else do we make decisions in our lives? Of course, we weigh the data and we ask the experts. We ask Google. Sometimes we even flip a coin. But usually, we listen to the still, small voice inside of us. And of course, our decisions have consequences. But in the end, we're usually much more defined by how we live within the choices we've made than about the choice at all. The priests want certainty, and they will use whatever they can to try and get it. And while I imagine the priest who enters the Holy of Holies, equipped with the Urim Batumim, feels comforted that God will help him make decisions, he must know somewhere inside of him that this kind of absolute certainty is simply impossible. He must know that he has to do his best, that he has to do what feels right. He has to act humbly and slowly, and then be decisive. He has to know that it's okay to make a decision and move forward. And even as the high priest hangs on to this certainty, provided by the Ori Batumi. He also knows, and we know, that that connection will ultimately fade. A Mishnah of the rabbinic period teaches, Mishemeto nevi'im arishonim batlu Orim Batumi. When the first prophets died, the Orim Batumim were nullified. From this period on, from the period of the early prophets, the tools of divination of the biblical period ceased to exist. What then could be relied on? And I suppose in a dramatic Disney version of this moment, a wise animal would emerge from the forest and say, well, of course, the Ori and Batumim were inside of you all along. And you might know already that I'm not that Pollyannish about these biblical texts. But I think that the Torah also knew what the high priest was thinking. That Aaron did hold the Ori and Batumim right by his heart. And that biblical and medieval Hebrew, actually, the heart and mind, the word lev, are pretty interchangeable. So perhaps the answers were inside of him. Not because he wore the breastplate of decision, but because he had the courage to put on the priestly garments in the first place. The researcher Brene Brown calls the things we do to protect ourselves from vulnerability our vulnerability armor. She outlines all the ways in which we armor up in the world to protect ourselves from uncertainty and from future pain. And she explains that in order to do the hard stuff in life, we eventually have to take the armor off. I imagine that's what it must have felt like for these early rabbis, those who had to make decisions without the Ori Batumi, stepping into a new world without the structures that they once relied on for certainty. For now, we just have animals predicting the Super Bowl. And I suppose that's okay. And not just because I'm a Philadelphia Eagles fan and they were eliminated from contention weeks ago, but also because I know that we can't rely on true certainty. I can only rely on vulnerability in this moment. And the resilience I find in my Judaism, and so importantly in my community, it's the resilience on which God's name is written. And we wear it to help us carry on. Shabbat shalom.